Hey, what's going on, folks? This is CJ here. We're here for a very special episode of Comic Book Corner. Um, it's been a while since I've done a Comic Book Corner episode, and given that it's the start of 2026, I want to kind of like go forward and kind of keep a very consistent stuff with Comic Book Corner in terms of not only just talking about a lot of the hero movies and television shows, but just also just comic books in general. And I felt Wonder Man was a good way to kind of kick off the proceedings with that. Marvel Studios projects post Endgame has been a very interesting ride. Obviously, with the way the internet has operated in terms of really having a lot of people talk on it, it's varying degrees of where people feel about it and stuff. I've always felt that people kind of over exaggerated their feelings on it for good and bad. Um, and at least for me, they've only really had one legitimately bad project, and that was Secret Invasion. There was no way to really kind of like try to soft pedal, the quality of that show. That show just was not good at all. Like I saw the ideas of what they were trying to do, it didn't bring it home the way it should have. But past that, a lot of their projects that they put out were varying degrees of good to just okay. Some of their projects tied into greater narratives for certain characters. So you're talking things like, WandaVision, which tied into, Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness, which tied into Agatha all along. You know, you had things like Falcon Winter Soldier, which tied into Captain America Brave New World. And then you had some of the stuff like Loki, which in and of itself felt very self-contained within its story, which is fine. And then you had little special highlight shows like Werewolf by Night, which again, very self-contained, but it told a really good narrative. But in the midst of all that, you've had shows that were less concerned about kind of tying itself into whatever the latest movie that Marvel Studios is trying to push, and it was more concerned about the character journey. You had shows like Agatha all along, even though it tied into WandaVision and Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness, it was still a very self-contained show. Ironheart, Echo, and now Wonder Man. These are four shows that were more concerned about us as the audiences watching these characters go on their sort of character journey of who they are and their connections to the people that made them who they are, than trying to be like, all right, here's an antagonist that we're going to get set up to be the person they're going to have a big blowout fight at the end. No, you don't get that. And I'm probably going to do an episode on Ironheart, because I think I can definitely go into explanation on that. But going into Wonder Man, there was a lot of sort of like, what is this show? Because from the first trailer, nothing about it gave off like this was going to be a show about seeing Simon Williams go out here with his powers and just kick ass and take names. And it was very weird. It was kind of funny too, because when you watch the trailer, and I only watched the first trailer, I know they did like 2 trailers. When you watch it, you're seeing like, okay, so Simon Williams is an actor and he comes across Trevor and they're having wacky adventures, and we get some semblance of Simon having his powers, and that's it. And what you really have is a show that ultimately boils down to this. It's not concerned with trying to do the typical 3-act structure of, okay, how does Simon get his powers? What's his secret origin? Who's his antagonist that he's going to have to face off against by the end of the show? And what is his hero's journey that leads him to that end point of fighting his bad guy and saving the day and seeing how this ties into the greater narrative? No. What we have is a show about 2 men who are dealing with the weight of their struggles in life. Again, Simon is a guy who manifested powers. The show pretty much illustrates that he's a mutant, basically. Simon's a mutant who manifests his powers. And how does he maneuver with keeping his powers in check while also just trying to make it in Hollywood, and trying to make it big. On the other side of it, you have Trevor Slattery, who last we saw he was in Shang-Chi. The Mandarin the actual Mandarin had kidnapped him from the prison and all hail the king and basically captured him and held him in prison to be his entertainment and stuff. So, Trevor is coming back to the States. He ends up running across the Department of Damage Control, who one of the agents, Cleary, is the one that basically is pretty much, he comes to Trevor and says, hey, look, you didn't serve out your whole prison sentence. So here's what we're going to need you to do. If you give us data on Simon Williams, because we see him as a threat, then you're free to go. And it's through that Trevor ends up, coming across Simon. And there's a chance meeting that they have where Trevor's sort of viewpoint on Simon changes despite what he's been assigned to do. And it's great. And I think that represents like what makes this show work, is watching this relationship between Trevor and Simon just blossom. Because Trevor is a character that throughout the show, people see him and they're like, isn't that the guy that was Mandarin? And everybody's like, oh man, you're the Mandarin. But what makes the relationship with Simon and Trevor really work is that when Simon first meets Trevor, Trevor's already locked in his head that Simon's coming up to him like, oh yeah, I'm the Mandarin. But Simon is like, no. I've seen you in the movies that you did, and I loved them growing up. And you see like Trevor's ears perk up like, oh, this man really is very genuine and really knowing who I am. Okay. And it's that moment right there that you can see the wheels turning in Trevor, where he's like, man, I really don't want to turn this guy in. I really want to genuinely help him. So the whole crux of the show is basically Trevor and Simon find themselves auditioning for the in-universe movie for Wonder Man. There's a director, Von Kovac, who is going to direct a Wonder Man remake. And I think what was dope is the show shows like Wonder Man, like the movie in the MCU in this film. It's like a throwback to what Wonder Man looked like in the comics and stuff, right? And it's great. It has a very pulpy feel to it, the way they show it and stuff, right? So Von Kovac is like doing the remake of it. And the thing about the show is, besides just Simon and Trevor's relationship and them navigating sort of the ups and downs of show business and stuff in Hollywood, the show is also a love letter to Hollywood, much in the way of like how the studio was too. You're seeing all the inner workings of it and stuff, but you're seeing it with respect to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So one of the things that you end up finding out is that there's a doorman clause. And the doorman clause is basically, hey, there's no superheroes that can be in films, which lends itself to one of the things that I love about Marvel Studios. And I even like DC Studios too, mainly how James Gunn has been doing it, where I'm a fan of obscure characters. And there's an episode of Wonder Man where we follow Doorman. If you're unfamiliar with Doorman, Doorman is a legit Marvel character. He's a character that, think of Cloak from Cloak and Dagger in terms of his power set. Basically, he's essentially a mutant in a way. He got his powers from a Roxanne sort of spill and stuff. So it's through that he can actually teleport people through his body, which is why he's called Doorman. He kind of taps into the Dark Force dimension when he does that, similar to Cloak. So the show has a whole episode dedicated to Doorman with his origins and how he maneuvered through life. And he ends up coming across Josh Gad, who ends up getting him into show business and stuff. And he's riding on cloud nine. And there's a circumstance that happens involving Josh Gad that invokes the doorman clause. And funny enough, it's through that episode that you get an understanding of why Simon is maneuvering in Hollywood the way he is because he's a guy who's also a mutant and he's trying to keep this power that he has on the low so that he can get this role as Wonder Man. And you get it. And the show does a good job of making you sit with that. That's another reason why this show is so great, is because a lot of the central conflicts with the show is very relatable, and the show doesn't rush past it. It basically makes you sit with it and really marinate on sort of the stakes and understanding of why you get somebody like Simon who's going out of his way to fake being his handler. I say handler, fake being his sort of like agent in order for him to book the role. And then you see his being nervous and his way of, you find out he's the type of person that gets in his own way because he thinks that he knows more than what he's doing. And when you have somebody opposite of him and Trevor, who is like taking a liking to him because he wants to see him succeed, it's great to see how that relationship between them just blossoms because of their shared love with movies and being actors and just everything else. And even with Trevor, much like how Simon has to sit and marinate on his decision making, especially with his powers and his decisions on why he wants to be an actor and how that relates to his relationship with his family, especially his brother and his mom, Trevor is still reconciling with his decision of being the Mandarin and also just being in the position of having to help the Department of Damage Control in getting Simon, and he's very conflicted on that. And again, that's something else that the show does a good job of, is showing how conflicted Trevor is in doing it. And I'm going to spoil some stuff in this, but Trevor makes a decision in the film, and when I say in the film, in the show, that I love because it's showing that, number one, Trevor is doing it from a good place. And the show does a good job of showing the sort of consequences of it. And even when we sort of get the aftermath of that consequence, it still shows how much of a power that consequence had on Trevor and also Simon. And it doesn't kill the journey that these two had that net resulted in that decision that Trevor makes. And it's really great for it. But just going back, when I say at the top that the show isn't concerned with the origins of Simon, that's a good thing. You're going to see a lot of people talk about this, and I have to really emphasize this. Not if you know anything about Wonder Man's origins in the comic books, Wonder Man's origins is just as muddled as Hawkman's origin in DC Comics. So by virtue of them illustrating through Simon's interaction with his family that shows like, oh, he manifested his powers when he was a teenager. Okay, that makes sense. That's all you really need to know. You don't, again, the show isn't concerned with the hows of his powers. It's not concerned with, is he going to be a superhero? No, it's just concerned with seeing Simon get to his goal of being a movie star in Hollywood, because that was his dream. And that's also another thing too about this film, is watching these characters manifest this dream that they had through this movie with Wonder Man that Von Kovac is doing. And there's a really great moment in this show where Simon is understanding what he needs to do to become a great actor. You know, he's trying to crib from other movies in front of Von Kovac to make an impression, not understanding that that's not what they want. Stop, just do what works for you, not what you think the director wants. And that's something that Trevor is constantly emphasizing to Simon, like, yo, get out your head, stop doing these things. And Simon does a good job of also talking to Trevor and addressing things that he sees in Trevor that he needs to do better on and stuff. And it's great because, like I said, Trevor, as experienced as he is, he's still feeling a measure of guilt over some of his decision making on helping Damage Control. And I love it for him. I love seeing that progression with Trevor because it's like he sees that ultimately Simon isn't a dangerous guy. He's a good man. And the idea of him being a threat is just Trevor's not seeing that. And I think that's what makes it work when you juxtapose that with looking at Cleary's character, the character of Cleary in this show, where Cleary is clearly coming out of clearly, but Cleary coming off of Miss Marvel is just being very opportunistic because in his mind, it's like, all right, I'm going to use Trevor to get to Simon because again, he sees Simon as a threat, but then you start questioning, yo, Cleary, what is it about Simon that to you makes him a threat? And that's something that I love that the show addresses because even Cleary doesn't know what makes Simon a threat. He just sees Simon as a stepping stone for him to get a big promotion, in damage control. Because again, another thing that this shows, subtly is the fact that damage control is kind of in trouble right now because of the fact that it's not really doing what it's set out to do. And they're kind of getting government funding cut from them because they don't see the point of them existing and stuff. And I think that's a lot of it is fallout from Miss Marvel because of how damage control in that show was being run by the previous leader and such. But again, those little details with damage control and all that, it doesn't deviate. It's not important, but it's shown importance enough that it doesn't deviate from the overall through line of the show, which is the sort of character journey of Simon and Trevor. But I want to say something too. The Doorman episode I really liked because, again, it's the subtle sort of setups that they do when we're seeing the origins of, Damar Davis, who is Doorman, and we're seeing what happens when he gets powers and how much that, the celebrity of it and the popularity of him, it didn't change him, but it's definitely a situation of like, all right, he's finding out firsthand how much the show business doesn't care about him overall and is great for it. And like I said, the visuals of it showing the Doorman's powers and stuff, I love that the show really does a good job of explaining it because again, Doorman is a fucking E-list character in Marvel Comics. And it was wild seeing that because I was like, that looks familiar. And it's like, oh shit, that's wow, they did that. And again, like I said, the episode is really just a cautionary tale of what Simon could have been had he actually outed himself as a hero. Like he could have been in the same situation as Doorman. And I like how that episode juxtaposed to the end where Simon is looking at that and is like, yeah, and that episode really also showed why Simon maneuvers the way he does. Because ultimately at the end of the day, even though he likes this shit, even though he likes being an actor, it's still very dangerous. And that also ties into this whole thing of him having to keep his emotions and all that stuff down because it ties into, his powers and all that stuff. So by the time you get to the end of the show, he has a measure of control over his powers now because it's like him becoming famous, him, coming to terms with Trevor's sacrifice, for him. He's finally got that weight off his back, and it makes how this show ends perfect. It's perfect. Something else too that I loved is we get an episode where Trevor and ends up seeing Simon's family, and I loved seeing the sort of like Haitian culture being put on full display, and how there are people in Simon's family that don't respect him because he's an actor, including his brother. And his mom loves him so much because she's proud of him regardless and stuff, but his brother doesn't respect that he's an actor. His family members don't respect that he's an actor, and that's kind of par for the course for a Haitian family like that. They're like, what is that, right? but I love it because much like how in Falcon Winter Soldier we're seeing Sam Wilson's community come out for him, even beyond just him being the Falcon, it's the same thing here with Simon and his family. It's that sense of community and stuff. And that's also the other thing that kind of helps with Trevor's character journey because you're seeing him really like, I'm really conflicted on this because, yeah, I want to see this kid succeed because we're both actors. But to be around his family, it's really kind of changing me on really how I see what I am supposed to be doing with damage control because I don't want to do this. This isn't right. I think damage control got it wrong, and that's what makes it great. So, just a spoiler, Trevor by the end of the show decides in order to save Simon and to cover for him, because Simon in the previous episode had, expressed his frustrations at Trevor, revealing that he was working for damage control, he kind of explodes and blows up a piece of the movie theater lot. So Trevor decides, hey, I'm going to put myself out there as the Mandarin again in order to save Simon. And it's that moment right there that really punctuates how much of a friend that Trevor truly was to Simon. And it's just pitch perfect. And I think that's what makes Wonder Man so great is that it has a lot of heart. It's telling a very good, well thought out story. And it shows that you can make a show that doesn't have to be wholly connected and at the mercy of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is doing on their movie side of things, or whatever the flavor of the month of whatever big sort of overarching storyline that Marvel Studios is trying to do. And it's especially weird for me though, because it's kind of funny when people think of like Marvel Studios, there was always this thing of, oh man, why is everything connected? Why can't we have something standalone? And then when you get something standalone, you get a segment of people be like, well, what is it connected to? This doesn't make any sense. And it's just, I kind of pay those folks dust because it's like, well, pick a lane on what you want. And I think Wonder Man, if you're somebody that reads comics and you read miniseries of shows, that's what this show is. It's a miniseries following a character within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And we're seeing a lot of the things that the Marvel Cinematic Universe teed up and had, this show pretty much addresses it. Because like I said, the fact that the doorman clause is sort of an extension of the Sokovia Accords, you're kind of like, oh, this is kind of setting up like, the Mutant Registration Act a little bit. We're seeing at least the genesis of it a little bit. Okay, this is interesting, and just like I said, overall, just seeing the fact that this is a universe where Hollywood is business as usual, and yet we know that heroes exist in this world, and it's fine. I know there's going to be some folks that are going to see that and feel that this show should have did the typical hero's journey, but I don't know. I just feel like ultimately you don't have to have every show be that way. And I think overall that's what makes Wonder Man such a success, and also it's a surprise success for some people, because I think there was folks, rightfully so, that saw the initial trailers for Wonder Man and were kind of very baffled on how this is all going to work. And when you see the final product, you kind of sit back in amazement like, wow, they actually did a really good job with this. I want more. And that's why I tied back into the beginning. I said that that's what, to me, why I loved Echo. Because again, as much as Echo had semblance of connectivity to, Hawkeye and even Daredevil, that was less of that show's concern on trying to tie itself to those things. And it was just more focused on Echo and her relationships with the people that shaped her to who she was, whether it's Fisk or whether it's her brother, her uncle and all that stuff. That's what the show was more concerned about, was Echo's character journey. Same thing with Ironheart. Ironheart, another one where, yeah, you got your action beats and all that stuff. And yeah, you had the Hood and all that stuff as the main bad guy, but like that, all those things was secondary to sort of gaining an understanding of who Riri Williams was as a person and how her past, she had to overcome it. And like I said, that's what makes the whole thing just kind of ties together with Wonder Man, is that you're really enjoying and digging the acting. And like I said, shout out to Ben Kingsley and shout out to Yahya Abdul Mateen. They both did a phenomenal job in their respective roles, and you really believe that relationship and that they're truly friends. And I'm one of those people, I want to see more of this. I 100% want to see more of that. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought of Wonder Man. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that. This is kind of like my sort of like review of it and stuff. I don't want to really go too long on it and stuff, but yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Just let me know what you guys thought of Wonder Man. I'm really curious on that, and you know, I'll probably read the comments on the next episode of Comic Book Corner. So with that in mind, yeah, I will catch you guys later. Peace.
Hey, Kuro, turn it up.